On a cool September weekend in 2003, two young families drove east out of Seattle chasing clear skies and mountain air along the North Cascades highway. They turned off onto a narrow forest road, bumped their way a few miles into the trees, and disappeared into the kind of wilderness where cell service dies and the nights drop into the 40s. They parked, unloaded their coolers and tents, and hiked in toward a small clearing beside a creek. Neighbors would later remember how excited the kids were about camping under the stars, how the adults talked about needing a break from work and noise. By sunset, the group David and Karen Lawson with their two children and their close friends Mark and Lisa Turner with their two boys had vanished into the timbered slopes of the Cascades, just one more happy camping trip in a place they all thought they understood. 3 days later, when they failed to return to work, to school, to daycare pickups and Monday routines, the alarm finally went out. Search teams pushing up a side trail off the highway found the first scene tents, standing open, sleeping bags left behind. Food lanterns and gear scattered as if someone had walked away mid-evening. No footprints leading out. No note. No bodies. Just a silent campsite in the middle of miles and miles of forest. The 8 of them were gone. For 7 months, that empty campsite was all anyone had. Then, in early spring, 2 hikers bushwhacking through a ravine miles away would stumble on a single weather-beaten tent, half buried in moss and rock. A tent that investigators would later tie directly back to those missing families. If you're listening to this right now, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had something unexplained happen out in the woods, share it in the comments. Before the disappearance, nothing about the 2 families suggested danger. If anything, they seemed like the kind of people who used time outdoors to keep life simple and steady. The Lawsons, David 42. A maintenance supervisor for a school district, and his wife Karen 39, a part-time medical assistant, had spent years taking their children 9-year-old Tyler and 6-year-old Emily on weekend trips into the Cascades. They lived in the suburbs north of Seattle, close enough to the mountains that a day hike or camping trip never felt like an undertaking. Their closest friends, the Turners, shared that rhythm. Mark Turner, 44. An engineer who worked out of Everett, and his wife Lisa, 38, a middle school English teacher, had 2 boys, Caleb 12 and Josh 9, who saw the Lawson kids almost every weekend. The adults had known each other since their 20s, first crossing paths at a neighborhood barbecue, and later becoming inseparable through school events, church picnics, and years of shared babysitting duties. The 4 parents trusted each other implicitly. Their kids moved between houses the way a single family might, trailing backpacks, forgotten sweatshirts, and half-finished board games from one living room to the next. When the weather warmed in late spring or dipped into that crisp early fall chill that makes campfires feel sacred, the 2 families often loaded up their SUVs and slipped into the mountains for a day or 2 of quiet. The trip in September 2003 was no different. They'd planned it for weeks, a simple weekend away before school routines and fall projects tightened their schedules again. The North Cascades had always drawn them not just for the scenery, but for the privacy the deeper trails offered. Around the small towns scattered along Highway 20, people are accustomed to hikers coming through with their packs, their topo maps, and their easy confidence. Locals know the terrain well enough to respect it, but they also know how quickly it can swallow a wrong step or a wrong turn. Even in early autumn, temperatures can slide into the 40s at night, and rain systems sweep down from the Canadian border without warning. The Lawsons and Turners understood those risks, but they also knew the essentials of backcountry camping food stored properly, fire managed carefully, a campsite chosen with an eye toward runoff and wind. They left home mid-morning on September 12th. The forecast was stable, the skies clear, and the trail they planned to follow was one David had hiked once in his 20s. It wasn't an official campground, just a narrow side path pulling away from a secondary forest road a few miles off the highway, the kind of place people who know the mountains tend to favor. The 2 families liked the freedom of remote spaces. No crowds, no generators humming from RVs, just trees, water, and room for the kids to run without fences. The hike into their chosen spot wasn't long, maybe a mile and a half, and the terrain was manageable for children. A creek curled around the clearing where they set up their tents, and steep ridges rose on either side, framing the sky in long, jagged cuts that glowed orange as the sun set. For families accustomed to suburban neighborhoods and predictable routines, it felt peaceful, even comforting. The children had grown up visiting places like this. The adults knew how to pace themselves, and for the first hours of that afternoon and evening, nothing at all seemed unusual. People who spoke to investigators later described both families as responsible, prepared, and unlikely to take unnecessary risks. David kept a laminated map in his pack. Mark carried a small repair kit he jokingly called his mountain toolbox. Karen and Lisa coordinated meals and kept an eye on the kids. They weren't thrill seekers or novices. They were simply taking one last weekend before fall set in and work calendars filled up. Still, the North Cascades hold a kind of stillness that can feel different the farther you move from the main trails. Beyond the viewpoints used by tourists, the wilderness grows darker, denser, and markedly less forgiving. Even longtime hikers acknowledge that the region has pockets where sound behaves, strangely echoes carrying unevenly through the canyons, branches breaking in the distance, without clear direction, the wind shifting abruptly around cliff faces. Rangers often remind visitors that remoteness itself can distort a person's sense of safety. A misread sound, a sudden gust, or a nighttime animal moving through brush can unsettle even experienced campers. That night after dinner, after the kids settled into their sleeping bags, and after the last ember of their fire settled into a faint glow, something happened. A single sharp crack, unnatural, abrupt, cut through the trees. The adults heard it clearly. The children stirred. The forest went still in a way that seasoned hikers describe as heavy a silence that drops all at once. What exactly the Lawsons and Turners thought in that moment remains unknown. What investigators would piece together later suggests only this: they were concerned enough to stay awake longer than planned. They kept watch. They checked the perimeter of their campsite. They waited through the hours when the cold settles low to the ground and the woods grow thick with shadows. It should have been an ordinary night in the mountains, stars above creek running nearby tents zipped against the chill. But by dawn, everything would be different. The families would never be seen alive again, and the campsite, still standing but eerily abandoned, would become the opening scene of one of Washington State's most unsettling wilderness cases. Sometime between the final hours of September 12th and the first light of dawn on September 13th, 2003, the Lawson and Turner families disappeared. The campsite they had built so carefully, 2 tents, a ring of stones around a dying fire. Food sealed in plastic tubs remained behind, as if the people inside had simply risen in the night and walked into the trees without a word. But nothing was disturbed. Nothing was broken, and no clear path led out. The first signs that something was wrong. On Monday morning, September 15th, when both families were supposed to return to work and school, the first ripples of concern began. A neighbor noticed the Lawsons' house still dark at 7:00 a.m., unusual for a family whose kids usually caught the bus before 8. At the Turners' home, a coworker called when Mark didn't show for a crucial engineering briefing. By noon, Lisa's school district had reported her absent without notice. Calls went out. Messages piled up. No one answered. Every phone rang straight into voicemail. By early evening, unease hardened into fear. Family friends compared notes, realized both families had planned the same weekend trip, and contacted authorities. What began as a routine welfare check quickly escalated into a missing persons report involving 8 people, 4 adults, and 4 children deep in Cascade wilderness, with no communication for days. The search begins. Washington State Patrol coordinated with the National Park Service and county deputies, forming an emergency response team that arrived at the forest road by dawn on September 16th. The family's two SUVs were still parked where they had left them, pulled slightly off to the side as if they had intended only a quick weekend retreat. Nothing inside the vehicles suggested panic. No torn maps, no blood, no broken glass, just jackets, empty cups, and a weekend's worth of supplies waiting for their owners to return. From that point on, the search teams moved in on foot rangers in green uniforms, deputies and tan volunteers in bright orange windbreakers spreading out along the trail that led into the canyon. When they reached the clearing where the families had camped, the scene stopped them cold. Two tents stood open, the zippers half down. Sleeping bags lay crumpled inside as if the children had crawled out moments before. A cooler on its side leaked melted ice into the dirt. A lantern sat upright, but unlit. A stack of firewood remained untouched. There were no drag marks, no heavy footprints, no sign of struggle. Not a single clue pointed to where 8 people could have gone. Veteran Ranger Margaret Ellison, 52, who had worked the Cascades for decades later, described that moment as the kind of quiet that gets inside your bones. She noted the absence of wildlife tracks, the undisturbed ashes in the fire ring, and the startling stillness in the air. It was as if time had stopped the second the families vanished. A wilderness that swallows sound. The North Cascades are some of the steepest, most complex mountain systems in the Pacific Northwest. Dense fir and cedar forests absorb sound. Ridges rise more than 4,000 feet in abrupt angles. Creeks carve narrow ravines where echoes bounce unpredictably. Even experienced hikers can lose their sense of direction in minutes. Search teams shouted the families' names into the woods. Their voices dissolved into the trees. Helicopters arrived by midday, white, blue, and yellow against the dark canopy, scanning the terrain with infrared sensors. But the steep ridges and sharp temperature shifts made heat signatures unreliable. More than once during the operation, pilots reported seeing shapes between the branches only for them to vanish when they circled back. Volunteers followed tributaries, marked out grids, and pushed through brush so thick it clawed their jackets and tore at their gloves. It was slow, exhausting work. By the end of the first full day, nothing had been found. Not a jacket, not a footprint, not a single broken branch that clearly belonged to the missing families. False leads, dead ends, and growing public fear. By September 18th, the story had reached local news. Parents in nearby towns began calling authorities reporting possible sightings, though none held up to scrutiny. A trucker claimed he saw a man and 2 children walking along Highway 20. Investigators confirmed it was an unrelated family. A couple in Winthrop submitted a photograph taken at a gas station, but the image resolution was too poor to identify anyone. A hiker said he heard voices in the forest late at night, but when deputies followed him back to the site, the only sound was wind moving through the trees. Fear spread quickly through both families' workplaces and social circles. Candlelight vigils appeared at schools. Colleagues of David and Mark printed maps and handed out flyers at supermarkets and hardware stores. Children drew pictures of their missing classmates and taped them to the windows of local shops. With every hour that passed, hope thinned. Inside the search command center, a temporary command trailer was brought in and parked near the trailhead. Maps were pinned against the interior walls, forming a patchwork of lines, ridges, watercourses, and marked grids. Rangers debated possibilities: an animal attack, a wrong turn, a sudden storm, a slip into one of the many unmarked ravines. But nothing matched the evidence or the lack of it. No blood, no torn gear, no signs of a bear or cougar encounter, and above all, no footprints leading away from the campsite. A missing persons expert from Spokane noted the peculiarity: people always leave traces, even when they don't mean to. But the Lawson-Turner campsite was unlike anything he'd seen. Searchers pushed deeper. Over the next days, teams expanded into increasingly dangerous terrain. They rappelled into gorge openings where the creek narrowed between rock walls. They crossed downed trees, slick with moss and early morning frost. They waded through chest-high water in places where currents could knock a person off balance in seconds. But every promising lead dissolved on inspection. A set of small prints turned out to be deer. A torn piece of fabric belonged to a hunter's jacket from months earlier. A bit of blue plastic that volunteers hoped was part of a child's backpack proved to be part of a tarp discarded by campers years before. Meanwhile, families of the missing stood by at the trailhead clutching thermoses of coffee that grew cold in their hands, asking rangers the same questions again and again. Have you found anything? Did the dogs pick up a scent? Are you sure you searched that ridge? Search dogs were brought in, German shepherds, bloodhounds, and labs trained for missing person recovery. They sniffed clothing collected from the families' homes, circled the campsite, then wandered outward in looping trails before losing the scent completely at the tree line. It was as though the trail ended the moment the families left their tents, widening the search radius. By September 22nd, the search had become one of the largest in that part of the state in years. Additional volunteers arrived from Wenatchee-Bellingham and as far away as Portland. National Park Service personnel established checkpoints along nearby logging roads. Helicopters made tighter sweeps flying lower, risking turbulence from the canyon walls, but the Cascades offered no answers. A rainstorm rolled through on September 23rd, drenching the ground, erasing any faint impressions that might have helped investigators reconstruct the family's movements. Temperatures dropped into the 40s overnight. The longer the search lasted, the more grim the calculations became. 4 children, 4 adults, no supplies, no shelter beyond what they might have improvised. Survival odds shrank with every hour. Even so, the search continued. Nobody wanted to be the team that gave up too soon. The emotional toll. By the end of the first week, exhaustion set in. Volunteers staggered into the command center with red eyes, wet boots, and trembling hands from cold and fatigue. Many were parents themselves. The idea of 4 children lost in that vast, punishing landscape weighed heavily on everyone involved. Families brought food for the searchers. Churches sent blankets. Local restaurants provided free meals for volunteers. The community tried to fill the silence with kindness, but nothing could quiet the gnawing sense of failure. Every few hours, someone would stop mid-sentence, listening, hoping for a shout, a whistle, or any sign of life echoing down from the ridges. No sound ever came. A search that turns cold. By early October, official teams scaled back. Winter was coming. The probability of survival was nearly zero. Law enforcement issued statements acknowledging the uncertainty but refusing to close the case. They left the campsite intact, marked off with tape in case future clues emerged. And then, nothing. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Snow fell over the clearing, smoothing the ground into a white, untouched blanket. Hikers avoided the area. The woods grew quiet again. For 7 long months, the disappearance of the Lawson and Turner families remained a void. No suspects, no sightings, no evidence of foul play, no confirmed accident. Only questions. And then, in early spring, a discovery miles away would break the silence and pull investigators back into the depths of the Cascades. A single tent, weathered, crushed under moss and debris, would reopen the case and change everything they thought they knew. 7 months passed before the wilderness finally stirred. Winter had buried the Lawson-Turner disappearance under snow rumor and reluctant acceptance. By early April 2004, the case existed mostly in quiet conversations, parents tightening their grip on their children's hands during hikes, rangers second-guessing trails they'd once considered safe. Even investigators still dedicated spoke less often about rescue and more about retrieval. Then, on the morning of April 6th, the mountains gave something back. Two college students from Western Washington University, Evan Porter, 21, and his classmate Jillian Reyes, 20, were hiking deep inside a ravine off an unmarked spur trail. They were out there for a geology project, mapping sediment layers along the creek bed, not searching for anything human. The sky was overcast, the air damp with the kind of cold that lingers under dense canopies long after winter has receded elsewhere. Around noon, Evan spotted something that didn't match the natural palette of greens, browns, and gray-blue rock. A patch of muted fabric streaked with dirt and flattened beneath a web of moss lay half exposed under the weight of fallen branches. At first, he thought it was an old tarp or discarded equipment from an illegal campsite, but as he brushed away debris, he realized it was a collapsed tent. And not just any tent. It was the exact model investigators had recorded at the Lawson-Turner campsite. Jillian remembered the silence between them, the kind that feels heavy, deliberate, before she whispered, "This has to be theirs." They backed away carefully and called 911. Law enforcement returns to a case they thought they knew. Ranger. Margaret Ellison heard the report while finishing paperwork at the station. The moment the dispatcher said the words, collapsed tent and possible match, she stopped everything. Within 2 hours, she and a search team were hiking into the ravine ropes and harnesses clipped to their packs. The terrain was steep and slick, carved over centuries by spring floods. The ravine was an area never fully explored during the initial search, too dangerous, too unstable in late fall. Now, without snowpack, the ground was visible, revealing what winter had hidden. The tent lay in a shallow depression along the ravine's edge, its fabric-torn poles, bent seams, split. It hadn't simply collapsed. It had been moved, dragged, battered, and carried far from wherever it had originally been pitched. As Ellison knelt beside it, she noted how the stakes were warped and twisted as though ripped violently from the ground. Inside the tent, crime scene technicians recovered 2 items. The first was a small hiking shoe, a child's size, mud-soaked, faded, but intact enough to identify. It likely belonged to 6-year-old Emily Lawson or 9-year-old Josh Turner. The second was a scrap of torn clothing, a piece of a jacket sleeve that forensic analysts later confirmed matched apparel worn by one of the Turner boys. After months of silence, the tent was a voice. A strained, fragile one, but a voice nonetheless, a shifting narrative. When investigators photographed the tent and examined the soil trapped in its seams, a new theory began forming. Dr. Nadine Roper, a forensic environmental specialist from the State Crime Lab, noted that the sediment caked into the tent's interior was not from the original Lawson-Turner campsite. It was darker, denser soil found deeper in the forest, closer to flood zones. She proposed a scenario that contradicted parts of the earlier investigation. A flash flood triggered by heavy autumn rains in late September 2003 could have torn through the family's campsite, sweeping objects and possibly people downstream into the gorge. The tent's condition supported this. So did its location. So did the bent stakes. But the theory raised new questions. If the families had been swept away, where were the other tents? Where were the bodies? And if the flood had been that powerful, how had no one heard it? The emotional ripples of a single find. When news of the tent surfaced, the surviving relatives of the Lawsons and Turners gathered at the county sheriff's office. Some hoped the discovery meant answers were finally coming. Others feared what those answers would reveal. The only certainty was that the discovery reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. A cousin of David Lawson spoke quietly to reporters. "I don't know what to feel." Relief. Dread. "I just know we're back in it again." Investigators understood that sentiment. After months of stalled leads, the tent injected the case with urgency, but also with dread. A single piece of evidence had returned, but it came alone. There were no footprints around it, no indication that anyone had survived beyond the initial event. No trace of what happened after the tent was dragged or carried or swept into that ravine. Still, for the first time in months, there was direction. How the discovery redirected the investigation. The tent's location forced law enforcement to revisit areas previously deemed low priority. The ravine led to a narrow gorge with a violent watercourse during storm seasons, an area search teams had avoided early in the case due to collapsing rock and unstable footing. Now, rangers rappelled into the gorge, their harnesses scraping against cold stone as water roared below them. Drones were deployed to map the terrain. Flood paths were reconstructed with hydrological models, estimating how far objects could have traveled and where human remains might have become trapped. Within days of the tent discovery, additional clues surfaced nearby. A metal water bottle engraved with initials matching one of the adults. Fragments of a child's backpack tangled in brush. A broken flashlight crushed against a rock wall. None of these items proved survival, nor did they confirm deaths. But together they painted a stark picture of chaos, a violent natural event scattering belongings through some of the most inaccessible chasms in the Cascades. The narrative that had once focused on a mysterious disappearance now shifted toward a likely catastrophic flood. But even that theory could not explain everything. Why no remains? Why no secondary campsite? Why no sign of human movement after the initial wave of destruction? Uncertainty hung over every new discovery. Hope, dread, and the call back into the mountains. The tent acted like a spark in dry grass. Search crews, quieted by winter, returned in force. Family members revisited the trailhead that had once held only grief and unanswered questions. For the community, the discovery was almost cruel in its timing. It revived hope while simultaneously deepening the mystery. It was a reminder that the mountains still held more to say whether investigators were ready to hear it or not. For Ranger Ellison, the discovery felt like a summons. The case was awake again, breathing again, and the mountains silent for so long were beginning to give back pieces of a story that had been buried under snow and time. What none of them yet realized was that the tent was only the beginning. More evidence, scattered, fragile, heartbreaking, waited deep in the gorge, ready to pull this investigation into places far darker than anyone had anticipated. The discovery of the collapsed tent in early April 2004 forced investigators back into a case they had once feared would never move again. For months, the disappearance of the Lawson and Turner families had felt like a void. No footprints, no witnesses, no bodies, no direction. But the tent, damaged and half buried in the ravine, cracked that void open. From that moment forward, every piece of evidence, every scrap of fabric, every tool mark, every trace of sediment would be examined with renewed urgency. What unfolded over the next weeks was a slow, methodical peeling back of layers, each revealing a darker truth beneath. Returning to the Gorge Ranger, Margaret Ellison assembled a combined team of forest law enforcement county deputies, hydrologists, and forensic archaeologists. Their objective was simple in wording and monumental in practice: reconstruct what had happened to 8 people in a wilderness known for giving up its secrets only reluctantly. The ravine where the tent was found flowed into a deeper gorge carved by decades of violent runoff. Steep walls rose 60 to 70 feet on both sides. Spring melt had increased the creek's speed, so rope systems were installed along the rock face. Investigators moved slowly, halting often to mark anything that looked unnatural: a snagged strap, a twisted root, scratches on stone. 2 days after the tent's retrieval, a deputy spotted a metallic glint wedged between 2 boulders. Once recovered, it proved to be a stainless steel water bottle engraved with the initials D.L. David Lawson's. 10 yards downstream, tangled in a thicket where the water slowed briefly, was a fragment of nylon webbing belonging to a child's backpack. No name remained on it, but its color pattern matched the pack 9-year-old Josh Turner wore during the trip. The items were cataloged, photographed, and carried out by hand. Every find pushed investigators deeper into a theory they had initially dismissed. The families had not simply walked away. They had been taken by the landscape itself. Inside the crushed cave, a significant turning point came on April 10th, when a cliffside search team uncovered a small cave, its entrance half collapsed, its interior littered with debris. Floodwater had torn through it months earlier. Still inside, evidence waited. A broken flashlight lay near the back wall. Its casing was crushed, its lens shattered, but the battery pack remained. A lab later confirmed fingerprints belonging to a Turner family member. Not far from the flashlight sat a small toy pickup truck, one that had belonged to 12-year-old Caleb Turner. The placement of the items suggested that after being swept from their campsite, some or all members of the families had taken refuge here, if only briefly. Investigators carefully documented the cave's layout. Sand patterns along the floor showed pooling water, and leaves packed into one corner indicated an attempt to insulate or create a sheltered space. Still missing, however, was any sign of the people themselves. No clothing beyond the items found, no biological traces, no remains. Yet there was something equally unsettling. If the families had huddled here after the flood, why had they left? Where did they go next? And why did the cave show signs of controlled movement rather than disorganized chaos? Those questions drove the next phase of the investigation, a breakthrough in the upper basin. On April 18th, a discovery in the upper basin reshaped everything. While combing through dense brush about a mile upstream from the cave, a ranger spotted an unnatural shape hidden under branches. Pulling the brush aside revealed a crude lean-to structure made from branches, tarps, and rope. Inside, investigators found objects that stopped even the most seasoned among them. On a damp patch of ground lay a notebook, its pages water-stained but the handwriting legible. It belonged to Karen Lawson. In it, she had documented the chaos of September 13th, describing a roar like thunder down the creek, the collapsing tents, and how she and the others had struggled to pull the children toward higher ground. Her last entry, dated September 14th, read simply, "Moving uphill. David hurt badly. Boys frightened. If someone finds this, please help us." Beside the notebook lay a child's drawing, 4 stick figures holding hands underneath a jagged mountain. The simplicity of the image suggested it had been drawn during that desperate attempt to survive. But the final clue at the lean-to was the most alarming footprints in the mud, older, larger, and inconsistent with any of the adults who had vanished. For the first time, investigators confronted the possibility that a third party had interacted with the families after the flood, identifying a human presence. Forensic technicians cast the footprint. The boot tread was narrow, deeply imprinted, and wore a distinctive pattern common to older work boots rather than hiking gear. Deputies compared the print to known locals who lived or operated in the rugged backcountry areas. One name surfaced repeatedly: Harold Hal Brenner, a 56-year-old reclusive trapper known to roam illegally across remote parts of the Cascades. Brenner had been fined for poaching twice in the past. He was known to set up temporary camps near water sources outside designated areas. And critically, he had been spotted near the upper basin in fall 2003, just weeks after the families disappeared. Deputies located him on May 4th at a rundown cabin 12 miles from the gorge. When they arrived, Brenner was packing gear into a worn-out pickup truck. Inside the cabin, investigators found canned food matching brands missing from the family's inventory list, rope fibers consistent with those used in the lean-to, a rifle oiled recently enough to suggest active use. Brenner was taken into custody, the first confession, under questioning. Brenner maintained a hardened demeanor at first, but as evidence mounted, his tone shifted. He admitted he had been hunting illegally in the gorge the night of the flood. He heard screams, terrified, disoriented, rushing water. When he approached, he found the families soaked, injured, shaken up. He said he tried to offer help, but panic overtook him when he saw the extent of their injuries. Instead of rendering aid, he picked up some of their unguarded supplies and left. Investigators pressed harder. Had he returned later? After a long silence, Brenner nodded. He confessed he came back at first light with another man, Cal Mason, a drifter in his 40s who sometimes camped with him. They found Karen and the children alive, but weak. David had a badly damaged leg. The kids were cold and exhausted. Instead of taking them out or calling for help, Brenner claimed he and Mason got scared they'd blame us. They took food blankets and left again, collapsing part of the lean-to to hide their visit. Deputies listening to the confession described a room thick with disbelief and disgust, but there was more. The second suspect and a disturbing new lead authorities launched a search for Cal Mason. On May 10th, they found his abandoned camp. Among the debris was a photograph grainy, damaged but unmistakable Mason standing next to a young boy no more than 10 years old. The child resembled one of the Turner boys. A rope found in the cabin also matched fibers pulled from the Lawson-Turner tent. Beneath a loose floorboard, investigators recovered a small composition notebook with Josh written inside. Its pages were soggy and partially illegible, but a few lines remained. "Man says he's helping us. Cold here. Don't feel good." This discovery ignited a grim search along the Skagit River where Mason had been seen in fall 2003. Divers found a submerged backpack 3 days later. Inside a child's t-shirt, a wet map the families carried on the trip, a page from a child's journal describing traveling with a strange man after the water came. For investigators, the horror was no longer hypothetical. Mason's capture and his admission. On May 25th, deputies received a report from a hiker who saw a man matching Mason's description near the river. After a tense 3-hour search, they cornered him in a ravine. Mason was thin, disheveled, shaking from cold and exhaustion. During interrogation, he contradicted Brenner on several points, but confirmed one crucial fact: he had taken one of the boys with him, intending to keep him safe. He admitted the child later fell ill, and in panic he left him near the riverbank. When detectives asked where the boy was now, Mason lowered his head. He had not survived. Search teams recovered bone fragments days later. DNA confirmed they belonged to Josh Turner. Reconstructing the timeline. Using all available evidence, investigators built the most accurate timeline possible. September 13th, 2003. A sudden flood tears through the family's campsite, sweeping tents, supplies, and people downstream. Late September 13th, early September 14th. Some members reach the cave and regroup. Injuries occur severe in at least one adult. September 14th. Families climb uphill, establishing the lean-to. Karen writes her final journal entry. Later on September 14th, Brenner and Mason encounter the surviving group, take supplies, and leave. September 15th. They return, see the group deteriorating, and again choose not to help. They collapse part of the shelter to hide their presence. Late September, Mason takes one of the boys. The rest remain at the lean-to or move again toward the ridge. Unknown date. The remaining 7 likely succumb to exposure injury or exhaustion. Their remains are lost to the gorge or buried by sediment. Brenner and Mason never harmed them directly, but their refusal to help and their theft of critical supplies sealed the family's fate. The search for the others. Over weeks, additional searches located scattered belongings. A child's sock near the ridge. A burned-over patch suggesting the families attempted another fire. A blanket embroidered with initials matching one of the Turner children. A broken compass belonging to David Lawson. But no additional remains were found. The gorge had swallowed them too deeply. The uncomfortable conclusion. By June 2004, investigators presented their formal reconstruction. The families survived the initial flood. They attempted to regroup, relocate uphill, and signal for help. They endured at least 24-48 hours with injuries and hypothermia setting in. They encountered 2 men capable of helping them but who chose self-preservation over action. The combination of natural disaster, isolation, and human negligence ended 8 lives. For many in law enforcement, this conclusion remains one of the most painful. Not murder, not abduction, but preventable deaths prevented not by the flood, but by indifference. Preparing for charges. Brenner and Mason were charged with reckless endangerment, obstruction, theft, negligent homicide later reduced to criminal neglect. Their actions didn't cause the flood, but their choices destroyed any chance the families had of surviving it. Investigators had finally connected the threads. The timeline made sense, the evidence aligned, but the truth came at a steep cost. Only one child's remains were ever recovered. The other 7 are still lost in the Cascades, held somewhere beneath rock water and time. The courtroom in Skagit County filled long before the proceedings began. By November 2004, the disappearance of the Lawson and Turner families was no longer only a regional heartbreak. It had become a case studied statewide for its tragic intersection of natural disaster, human failure, and the unforgiving terrain of the Cascades. When Harold Hal Brenner and Cal Mason were escorted into the courtroom, every bench was occupied. Relatives, neighbors, search volunteers, rangers who had spent weeks in freezing water, and community members who still carried the weight of unanswered questions. Witness after witness stepped forward. Ranger Margaret Ellison spoke first, walking the jury through the tent, the ravine, the lean-to, the cave, and the ridge. Dr. Nadine Roper's testimony followed, explaining how the flood patterns matched the debris field. The most difficult testimony came from forensic examiners reading passages of Karen Lawson's journal and recovering the timeline her words quietly preserved. When Brenner finally stood to speak, he did not attempt to defend himself. His voice wavered as he acknowledged abandoning the families, admitting that panic and self-protection overrode responsibility. He described the cries of the children, a detail that tightened the entire courtroom into silence. Mason's confession was more fractured, contradictory in places, defensive in others, but he too was unable to deny the evidence. His final admission that he left young Josh Turner by the riverbank when the boy became ill sealed the case. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. Brenner received 15 years. Mason received 20. These sentences did not satisfy everyone. Some family members believed the punishment did not reflect the full measure of the suffering endured. Others, exhausted, said it was enough simply to have the truth acknowledged in a court of law. What united them was the knowledge that nothing would bring back the 7 who remained lost in the mountains, and no sentence could fully account for the fear and pain the children must have endured in their final days. A community grappling with loss. When the verdict was read, a low ripple went through the courtroom. Not applause, not outrage, but the sound of people finally releasing tension held for over a year. Afterward, relatives gathered outside in small circles, some embracing, some quietly resting a hand on another's shoulder. Reporters hovered at a respectful distance. Interviews were brief. The emotions were too close to the surface. One of the Turner's cousins summed up what many felt. We needed answers. Now we have them. But closure, that's something different. In early December 2004, the community organized a memorial in the foothills near the trailhead the families had used. Volunteers planted 8 trees. Douglas firs spaced carefully in a half circle so that their branches would one day form a canopy. A bronze plaque was placed at the entrance to the grove engraved with each name. David Lawson, 42, Karen Lawson, 39, Tyler Lawson, 9, Emily Lawson, 6, Mark Turner, 44, Lisa Turner, 38, Caleb Turner, 12, Josh Turner, 9. At the dedication, the air was cold, heavy with mist rolling down from the ridges. Ranger Ellison spoke briefly, thanking the families for allowing the memorial on public land and recounting the dedication of the search teams who had refused to give up even when hope had dimmed. She ended her remarks simply, "The mountains keep many stories. Today we mark this one so it will not be lost." The grove became a place people visited in quiet moments. Teachers who had known the children hikers who had joined the searches and strangers who had followed the case and felt its weight. Institutional reckoning and change. The investigation left a deep imprint on the agencies involved. For the National Park Service and local sheriff's offices, the case exposed vulnerabilities in search coordination, especially when rising floodwaters or unstable terrain limited early access. In the months that followed, new protocols were issued, improved mapping of flood-prone backcountry zones, expanded use of drones in early stages of missing person searches, mandatory seasonal briefings about sudden weather events, updated warnings at trailheads about unmarked drainages and flash flood risk. The tragedy also advanced legislation, strengthening penalties for those who interfere with or obstruct rescue efforts on public lands. Brenner and Mason's actions, taking supplies, hiding evidence, failing to report surviving victims, became part of the testimony that pushed those measures into law. The lingering mysteries. Despite the enormous scope of the reconstruction, significant parts of the story remained obscured, lost to the water buried under rock or carried miles from the initial site. The remains of all but one child were never recovered. The precise moment when the group separated or how long certain members survived after reaching the ridge will likely never be known. Investigators acknowledged these gaps with humility, noting that some truths are simply beyond reach in the vastness of the Cascades. Search teams returned several times in the following years during low water seasons, hoping erosion or snowmelt might reveal something more: a shoe, a piece of fabric, a bone fragment. Nothing surfaced. With each season that passed, the likelihood of recovering the remaining 7 diminished. Nature had reclaimed them quietly and without trace. Even so, the timeline established by Karen's journal, the backpack notebook, the cave evidence, and the ridge findings offered a coherent picture of courage under extreme hardship. For the families, knowing that their loved ones fought to stay alive brought a bittersweet form of peace. A case that changed the region. Over time, the Lawson-Turner disappearance became a cautionary benchmark in the Pacific Northwest. Rangers referenced it when training new hires. Emergency responders studied the hydrological data as a reminder that heavy rain in steep terrain can destroy even a well-prepared campsite. Small towns along the North Cascades Highway organized annual safety talks at community centers, inviting officers to speak about wilderness risk and responsible backcountry travel. But beyond the procedural impact, the case touched something more personal. People who had never met the families carried their memory: families who canceled trips when storms moved in, hikers who checked their gear twice, locals who lowered their voices when driving past the forest road where the 2 SUVs had once been found untouched. The human legacy. For the surviving relatives, healing did not follow a straight line. Grief settled differently for each household. Some visited the memorial grove often, others avoided the mountains entirely. A few found solace in connecting with search and rescue organizations, volunteering at training events, or helping raise funds for new equipment. Each act, however small, felt like a way to honor what the Lawson and Turner families endured. Investigators, too, carried the case with them. Ranger Ellison later said that not a week passed without some memory rising: Karen's final journal entry, the toy pickup truck in the cave, the soaked blanket recovered at the ridge. For her and others who had combed the gorge, the story was not simply about loss. It was about the fragile line between survival and tragedy in landscapes people often underestimate. A quiet ending and an unquiet memory. In December 2004, after the trial concluded, Brenner and Mason were transferred to state custody to begin their sentences. They remained largely unremarked upon thereafter, fading from public view. The law had done what it could. The investigation had gone as far as nature allowed. What endured was the grove: 8 trees growing higher each year, their shadows lengthening across the clearing as seasons turned. Hikers still paused there, some reading the plaque, others leaving a stone, a flower, or a folded note. The Lawson and Turner families had set out for a simple weekend in the mountains. They expected quiet, a fire under the stars, and a return home before the work week began. Instead, a flood, a series of human failures, and the sheer indifference of nature swept them into a story that reshaped a region's understanding of wilderness risk and responsibility. The case ended, but the ache remained. In the hush of the grove where wind moves softly through the firs, the legacy of the 8 lives lost is neither forgotten nor sensationalized. It is a reminder, solemn, enduring, that truth, once uncovered, carries both clarity and sorrow, and that some chapters, even when closed, leave echoes that never fully fade.